Welcome to the Speaking Podcast. You can find all our episodes on speakingpodcast.com or also on BitChute and YouTube, a Speaking Podcast. I also have the Awakening Podcast, Meditation Podcast, Learn Polish Podcast, and the Crypto Podcast, and all can be found on roycollin.com. Today, my guest, I think she's doing more podcasts than myself. Please welcome Annemarie Cross.
Nice to be here, Roy. Thank you.
So before we talk about, we can talk about a lot of stuff on the speaking, and I definitely want to touch on the podcasting, but you might introduce yourself to the audience.
Sure. Yes. Well, as you said, Annemarie Cross. So I'm in Melbourne, Australia. I started podcasting in 2008, way back when I had to explain to people what a podcast was. Thank goodness that the world has caught up, and so many more listeners and people such as yourself doing awesome work in the space of their podcasts. But I was in the career industry then, and the reason we started, a co-host and I were very disillusioned about the doom and gloom mainstream media was portraying across every single platform at that time when the global financial crisis hit. And so we thought we need to be the voice of hope and inspiration. So we knew things were difficult. A lot of people had lost their jobs around the world, but we knew things were not hopeless and people needed to change their approach to job search. So we did the show for 2 years, had an incredible time, met so many awesome people around the world, which I'm sure you do each and every day with your podcasts too. And even though we parted ways, I continued to do podcasting ever since, and I've just loved it. Now I work not so much with executives and professionals, but rather with entrepreneurs, really helping them take their message, their expertise to be seen as a trusted authority. They can make a much bigger impact in the world with their message and build their business. So it's certainly been an interesting 13 years in the podcasting space.
Well, you mentioned in 2008, you were telling people, I started the Speaking Podcast in 2018. The amount of people I had to tell that was a podcast. I don't have to do it anymore, but so I can imagine 10 years earlier what it was like.
Yes, yeah. So many more speakers now because of what's happened in the world with so many platforms and face-to-face conferences and so forth. Podcasting is an incredible platform, isn't it, to share your voice and your reputation. So yeah, it's an exciting space, and a lot more listeners, as you said, been growing over the years, which is good.
And just since we're on that topic, when you had the co-host, because I have one where I'm I'm the student and for the Polish one, and then there's the teacher. I do another kind of conversation one, but not co-host kind of thing. So how did you find that? How do you did you have strategies did you had guests as well for that? I'm assuming.
Yes,
so did you have a strategy that one wasn't hogging the stage or one wasn't how did you did you have kinks to work it out? Because the reason I'm saying is some people want to set up a podcast now, and they might be I even know some of my listeners actually have set up one recently and they've co-hosted. Just giving them a bit of tips as well for somebody.
Yeah, great question. Back then, because it was such a new space, none of us really knew. We didn't even call it a podcast, but we just knew that we needed to get our message out there. But interestingly, my co-host had gone through a number of years earlier a 12-month how to be a radio host course, but he was told at the end of the 12 months, your voice is too squeaky, so you're not going to be good for the radio platform. But it was good to have that training. So I was slightly nervous when I first started. If you go back and listen, and the first 2 years of episodes are still up there, and they're rather cringeworthy. But anyway, it was good for the time and for the sound quality for that time, of course. But what I found was that he was quite able to have the conversation. It took me a few months actually to get comfortable. So, but we were able to navigate, when someone else was speaking, we kind of were silent, and then we could kind of pick up the nuance when the conversation was finishing. We probably had more difficulty with guests than with each other. We could kind of sense when someone had finished speaking, or we would end with a kind of, what do you think, Keith? My co-host's name was Keith. We had one guest that we asked the question, so tell us a little bit more about yourself and your business. And 20 minutes later, she was still raving on about how wonderful she was. So I think we had more problems with navigating how do we kind of cut off our guest and, not let them hog all of the airspace, so to speak. But we learned how to navigate communicate between each other. And we had a couple of things that we knew we'd finished, we'd ask a question. But one thing about a co-host that I would recommend for anyone who's thinking of establishing a podcast, one of the reasons why we stopped our podcast is that we really struggled to monetize that. And for the time and effort that we put into it, we weren't really seeing clients for our business. And there was a number of factors, I think, that had to do with the fact that both of us, whilst we were in the career space, we had different business models. He was very much working with clients who were more at the beginning stages of career change and job search, whereas for me, I was working more with senior executives, CEOs and so forth. So the topic that we spoke, whilst it was relevant and could be for, a number of job seekers, it wasn't niched enough for each other. So as we know in business, you really want to speak a message that it cuts through the noise and gets to the heart of the problems, the challenges, and issues that your ideal client is faced with. And our podcast was not niched enough. And so just be mindful, whoever you're co-hosting with, if the purpose and the outcome of your podcast is to generate clients and awareness of your business, then you want to make sure that you've got a similar audience. How are you going to, what's the call to action to get people off your podcast and onto your list, and so that you can build that community where you can continue to nurture. So those are things that I would really recommend someone consider before they get into a co-host situation, only to realize, hey, it's very difficult to have a co-host because both people are people that your audience, really starts to build know, like, and trust. But then if you try and take business away from each of those, it's a little bit difficult. So anyway, just some insights to consider.
Excellent tips. And I assume in them days it was kind of face to face, as opposed to now, like you're in Australia, I'm in Poland. Like at that time, because when I started, I used to sit down, but I didn't record it. I tried setting up the camera, but it wasn't working. But I found, you get to know the person a lot better, build a relationship. But now the quality is perfect doing Zoom. But yeah,
absolutely. Back then we used a platform, and it's still around today, even, called Blog Talk Radio. And back then only Skype had just started. Skype was still, that shows kind of, our age. And so the video aspect of that had not been, there really wasn't video. Video had not really been introduced. And so it really was only audio, and the audio was shocking. In fact, I've gone back and listened to a few comments, or seen a few comments on there. They said, are these hosts calling in from a submarine or something? It really does sound like we're, underwater, but that was the quality back then. I don't know if you ever heard of, tele seminar lines, tele chat and so forth. You really would just ring in on your phone. That's how how my co-host would ring in. He would get a phone card, I would dial in, and so the quality was really bad. But thankfully, as you say, the technology that we have at our fingertips now is pretty awesome. To think that you and I are now speaking, we're on opposite sides of the planets. We've got video, we've got audio, and it's high quality.
What I found, I think you probably kind of train yourself to, because recently I had a guest on and they didn't realize we were doing a Zoom, and they said, I'm not prepared for Zoom, and they wanted to cancel. And I said, look, we can start studio, and we had the cameras off, and because normally you'd get the cue, because I know straight away by looking at you when you're finished and then to come in. But when there's no picture, it's it's a different training. You have to be kind of conscious of, did they finish or they're just taking a breath?
Yes, I totally. And I've done both. And I prefer the visual aspect of that. Although I must say, because I do back-to-back interviews, so I like to batch everything, that when you have only audio and you're not actually looking at the person, it takes less energy than if you are looking at the video screen. I think neuroscience has shown that if you're looking at a screen and watching video versus just audio listening, the audio uses less, brain power and so forth. So less stress on the body, so to speak. So just another, fact that I've researched on video and of course audio.
So getting into your speaking, you might tell me your speaking journey when you were younger, because I know you've done a lot of workshops, keynotes and retreats and stuff like that. So you might just tell me, as you were younger, was it something that fazed you?
If I think back to when I was younger, I remember probably about the age of 3.5, 4. I remember standing on a kitchen table, kind of announcing to my older brothers and my family just some things, some rules and things like that. So I don't really think that I was ever really afraid of public speaking. Even at school, I used to love the show and tell. Did you ever have that at your schools, where you would bring something in, whatever that may be, and you would share a story about that? And I remember one of the young boys in my class, I would have only been, goodness, 7, 8 at the time, said, Miss, Annemarie's show and tells are always so interesting, because I had family that would travel a lot overseas, and they'd bring back dolls and stories of different cultures and things like that. And I would always love to share that on. And so I've always loved speaking. But you know what's interesting? I think so often people, we preempt something. So if we're fearful about speaking, getting up, whatever, a small group of people, large group of people, we can build ourselves up so much that we take ourselves out. I've heard of stories where, one of my colleagues had a husband who for many, many years had positioned himself for a specific role to apply for. And it was an internal promotion, finally got the job. And he was told, well, now this job's slightly changing and you are expected to now go and speak in front of groups of clients and teams from around the organization nationally. He said, I don't want the job. He turned it down because he did not want to speak. And so I think, I've never had a fear. I've just loved the being able to share and impact people. That to me, I think is amazing, that you can share a story and insights and wisdom. And if that helps someone, with a solution to something that they're struggling with, make someone, have a brighter day for something that they're struggling with, I think that's a job well done then.
I didn't do the show and tell, but like that's something that every school should do, because like I have a lot of guests, and sometimes, I was very late overcoming the fear of public speaking. And if you do that with children, once they start school, whether it's 4 or 7, depending on the country, they don't even think about it. They just get into the routine of doing that. And, that should be mandatory because a child is happy to show off their latest toy or whatever. As you say, if you've got, cousins giving you presents from abroad and it's a story, so people are learning, geography and everything else. And unfortunately, we didn't do it, but I think that, nice. That's something.
It does. Actually, now that you're reminded me, even at then we had intermediate school, because I originally came from New Zealand, and that was after primary school and between college. And so I would have been about 11 and 12, and they had speaking competitions, and I got to the finals, and I was able to speak to our whole the whole form. So this, the first and second form. And I remember the topic that I spoke about was trees. Of all things, trees. Don't know why. I still like trees. I'm a bit of a tree hugger myself. Love nature. So there you go.
Yeah. No, there's a book. I forget the name. I know I have it here. It's something about something about trees, and it is mind blowing the way that they, the roots. It's like an internet system, the way trees work. And
fascinating. That's a whole other topic of itself, isn't it? We need more trees.
Exactly. So with the speaking, then, like you've done keynotes, that you've. So you might let me know the way that you kind of structure yourself for it, and how you do you prepare for the keynotes.
Yeah, well, what I am always very mindful about, even if I've got a particular topic that I want to speak about, I'm always very particular in finding out from the organization or the event coordinator who is going to be there, what is the outcome that they're looking for, because that's also going to determine a few things, particularly the stories that I share, because you might have some specific insights that you want to impart with people, but I think the stories that you share around the insights just allows them to deepen the learning, if you will. But the stories that you share are going to be very different. So if it's an audience of people who maybe, a lot of the speaking that I have done has to do with business, marketing, personal branding, all of those kind of things. And so I will find out is this audience more just beginners in their business? Are they more startups in their business? Because they're going to relate more to more examples of how startups have used the different tools, techniques, and so forth that I'm sharing. Or are they more progressed in their business? So they're therefore going to have more challenges in a certain area. So that also very much refines the kind of topics that I really hone in on. Other things too, such as language. I know that might sound a little bit strange, like language. Are there people there that are primarily English speaking or more multicultural? You've got to be sensitive to these things, I guess, isn't it? Because some of the examples that you may share, the stories, they have no relevance to them. They may not know. And so I'm being very mindful of that too, particularly when I started podcasting, because some of the things that you might say, because I'm an Australian, I might say something or a bit of a joke, and that could be quite offensive to other people, around the in different cultures. And as this was a story that was driven home to me, and someone said that in the Chinese culture, when you go, I think there was a color green or something. I'm not 100% sure, but anyway, there was a color, and that color was given in a cap and in something to a Chinese businessman, and the Chinese businessman looked really horrified because that particular color, when it was given and extended, basically said something like, it means I'm having an affair with your wife or something. And that story kind of rung to me. I mean, not that I'd be talking about that kind of topic, but just being aware of the sensitivities of your audience is going to make sure that the examples that you share and some of the nuances are going to land well, because that is what they'll remember. If you say a joke that completely flops or offends, that's the thing that they're going to remember afterwards, isn't it? Because people don't really remember often what you say, but they'll remember how you feel. So not only is the topic that I share something that I make sure is relevant, but I also make sure the other conversations and the stories is such that allows them to have a good experience as part of being there.
And I know you mentioned about kind of catering for the audience, especially international. That's something that I didn't do at the start with the podcast, especially the Awakening one, that like I looked at the audience and I said, okay, it's like mainly 50% is American, then there's the UK, and I make sure that I cover points in them countries, because I have to serve, because, there's no point in, concentrating on the less than 1% of my audience. But a lot of people don't, and I wasn't doing that at the start. I was just kind of talking in general. I know you could be talking about, say, Ireland, and for some reason, I mean, I should have a high percentage of in Ireland, but I don't. It's like 1% or less. So even though I will mention Ireland, I don't put all my attention on it. And sometimes people, they do the opposite. And it's just to be conscious of who's actually listening to you.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of other things that I think is going to be very relevant to now as well is that finding out when you are speaking and what's happening before. So, and what I mean by that is, is the keynote, is it going to be something happening beforehand? Well, have people been sitting there for a long period of time? Because if they have and there's been no break, then you obviously will need to start. There might be something that you get them to do that will cause a bit of laughter and that you really engage, or get them to move a little bit. These kind of things can really help too, and in how you lead them, down the journey of your presentation. They may be coming back from a break, and you might be the first one that is on stage giving your keynote, and in that case you may want to bring everybody's attention. Then there may be some more people that come a little bit late. So all of these different things, if you know exactly how best to prepare, will allow you to come up with that right to start off that that presentation right from the word go. I think another tip that I learned myself was, is someone going to introduce you? Because there may be some things that you want them to introduce you in your introduction that you may not necessarily be able to say yourself, and you may want someone to say that for you. So rather than you say certain things about yourself and weave that into your story, getting someone to share that as they introduce you is going to land better better too from a social proof kind of aspect. So those are kind of things that I think of as well. And that can be really relayed to now, as so many people are now doing online presentations. You want to find out, how long have people been on the screen? Have they had a break? Can I show some slides as well as just, talking head? Can I provide them something to write down and take notes? So they're doing a bit of a kinesthetic movement and writing notes rather than just staring and looking at a screen. So I think of all these things, and how can I make this presentation be a good experience for someone, and can I do something, integrate something that can maybe break up that sitting and watching or just staring, or that kind of tiredness, because we have a certain amount of energy, don't we? And we want to make sure that when we're speaking and engaging with our audience, that they're able to maintain that level of energy, that we know they'll take away some real takeaways from that presentation.
The next one then is like workshops, because I know on your website you list all the different, because it's more corporate that you go. So one, you might tell us how you land the corporate clients. So what was your strategy for, because I mean, you've got, a lot that you've done, because some people, they're starting off and they haven't a clue what to do. And the other thing is like how long they are and how you structure it.
Yeah, interesting question. That's going to depend, I think, on organisation to organisation, and also to what the purpose is. Some organisations that they've had me come to deliver a workshop was maybe part of a series, and so and it might have been a lunchtime workshop for staff versus and staff want to be there. They've selected to be there, so it's not being compulsory. Versus we want you to come in here and deliver a workshop, and people have to come to this. It's a required. Because some people have to go to workshops in the workplace and they don't necessarily want to be there. So you've got to know these things, because in that case, you've got some rapport building, don't you, beforehand. You don't just want to launch into what you're presenting with if you know that there's a few people in there that have kind of, sitting there and thinking, I just can't wait till this finishes. So that's really important. Again, what I shared with the keynote, finding out as much as you can about the audience. I remember doing a workshop for a group of authors, and romance authors. I knew nothing about romance authors, so I had to do a little bit of research, but they wanted me to do a workshop on procrastination. And I sent a questionnaire through to the organisers and asked a number of questions, just not too many questions so that it was, a laborious effort on their part, but enough questions to give me an insight onto what they were interested in and why they would want to know more. And you know what? Even though I gave them some practical tips on how to overcome procrastination, with the feedback that I got from these authors, I could see a lot had to do with mindset. So I brought in actual activities to be able to do with them that identified the mindset. And you know what, interestingly, what the biggest barrier to cause people procrastination for these romance authors was rejection, fear of rejection. They procrastinated because if they finished their scripts, they would have to send it to the editors, and the editors might come back and say to them, you need to start from scratch. So these are the things that became apparent when asking the right questions, and so that I could bring the right activities as well. That's another point for a keynote too. A lot of times a keynote, depending on the audience number, are you able to get feedback from the audience or not? And so if you're not able to get a bit of feedback from the audience, you of course then that's going to limit the questions, feedback, interaction from the audience per se. In a workshop, typically you can. So you've got a bit of opportunity to, depending on the time, have some activities where they might be able to break up into small groups and be able to discuss things. So therefore you're not having to have so much information that they're overwhelmed, but have, different times and breaks through the workshop to be able to do some hands-on and some engagement within smaller teams. So that's really important. But again, finding out what is the needs, What's the outcome that that particular organization, what's the timing, what technologies are available, and how can you break up the room? How is the room actually set? I mean, some of these things might just sound, why would you ask that? But it's important because, are people going to be sitting in groups where they can, engage with one another, or is the room going to be set up in such a way that they're very much apart, or, kind of in a U-shaped? All of that can make a huge difference to, the atmosphere, the ambience of the learning space can make a huge difference to the outcome and overall engagement in learning. So does that help? Does that kind of give you some?
Absolutely. No, brilliant. And I'm just curious, did you procrastinate when you were writing your 2 books?
Yes. I think one of the strategies or tactics that I use to help is to change location, because it's kind of like a new location, new anchors, kind of call that anchors. I think in one particular chapter, I moved from room to room to room to room to room just to get it out. Sometimes it was like pulling teeth. So yeah, but I tell you what, it's so important to know what distracts you, what are some of the distractions that you have, and then to minimize those and set yourself time to write. And if you know what time of day you are at your most productive, schedule that time to write,
I found, because I wrote one, but I didn't publish it because it was kind of a bit too controversial, but I will be getting it out. And it was like, I found very early in the morning, kind of 6 o'clock was my time, but listening to music. So I'd have music in the background, and I found that I was most productive with that.
But not music with words, because then you end up singing along and you can't think about the words you're writing. That's what I found anyway.
So you might, because I know one of the books is about interviews and the other is about the podcast. You might tell us what the books were and not just explain them a bit.
Oh, absolutely. So the first book I wrote was in the career space. I love one of the areas was interview coaching. And so many of my clients would say to me, oh, why can't you do the interview? It just rolls off your tongue. And my schedule got so busy that I, could not interview coach a lot of people. And they said, well, could you write a book? And then we could kind of take that knowledge. So it really was getting my knowledge out of my head and putting it into a book. So it's called 10 Key Steps to Ace That Interview. That was the first one. And the second one, I really wrote that because I had gone from, doing a lot of podcasting and leveraging podcasting in my business, and then a lot of people started coming to me, can you teach us, can you show us? And I thought I really want to systematize what I do. So for me, my book was really getting it out of my head, putting it into a step-by-step book, because I knew that if that was written in a sequence which was understandable, or could be understood by people who read it, and that I could teach it, that it was then in a format that was teachable, that was repeatable, and so that was one of the reasons why I wrote that. And it was good. It was, really good to be able to get that all out of my head. But, one of the biggest things that made a huge difference was writing the headings, the chapter headings, and formatting that first so that there was this really nice flow. And then I would go back and have a look at the chapter headings and say, what articles have I written? What snippets from social media have I written that is, relating to that particular heading and that chapter heading? Put that in there, because it's a lot easier to edit than it is to create from a blank space. So get all of the information in, and then from there, I fleshed out the different chapters and so forth. And then once that was done, I kind of then went and edited it through. And you edit it to the point where you think, I can't read this anymore. I hate that book. You do, isn't it? You think to yourself, if I've got to read that whole thing one more time, I'll go nuts. And then, of course, you get an editor to go through that for you at that stage. But yes, do it in stages. I find works really well.
I'm not sure about you, because I've often, I used to work in construction and read specifications, and then they'd update a specification. So I would pick out little changes in it. And I've had a few people, they wrote books, they gave me, I would pick out, even when I'm reading, any book, I'll spot an error. The amount of errors I had in my own book was embarrassing, thousands. And I was even reading it, but I was told, read it out loud, because you're still reading it the way you You
in
think.
your head. Exactly. I had the same thing. You could stare at something and then go back a couple of days later. And it's normally you notice your own spelling mistakes when you're holding your published book in your hand and you think, oh my goodness, how did I miss that? But anyway, that book, I didn't share the title. That's called Industry Thought Leader, How to Go from Invisible to Influential and Profitable with a Podcast. So that was really good. And the reason I wrote that is because, again, I based one of my programs on that as well. Podcasting with Purpose, 90 days idea to launch. But I really like to focus on the branding, the positioning, the message, thought leadership, rather than the technology. And that's really where I focused a lot on this book. How do you bring the message? How do you stand out? How can you then monetize, your podcast? What are the mistakes that I made so that people don't make the same mistakes that I had to go through and struggle through? So that was one of the main reasons I wrote that book.
And like in the crazy times that we're in, I know a lot of people have to change their jobs because they're being forced to take the poison dart. So you might give one interview technique that you could tell people that might help them.
Well, I can do something better for you, actually. This is what I've said to all of mine. I'll give you some details on the show notes. I have got a resume writing course and I have got the 10 key steps to ace that interview. And I've said to anyone who is forced out of a job, no jab, no job, this is the policy that we have here in Australia too, they can access those 2 courses for free and my book for free. So I'll leave you so I won't only share a tip, but I can give them access to that writing a resume and that book for free. But one tip, again, to be prepared, so often we are so nervous when we're going to an interview. It is a conversation. It is just as much you ensuring that the company that you're interviewing with is just a good fit for you as you are for them, and so often I think as individuals, I know women tend to do this so well, men do too, but they're able to often speak their way through that anyway. We minimize our strengths, our abilities, and it's the chatter that goes on in our heads that often talks us out of delivering and just having a conversation. I remember interview coaching someone, Roy, who had been seconded into a government role. She was the only person that knew what she was doing in that role because of the diversity and the experience that she's had. So when the position came up for tenure, they'd written the job description with her in mind, and she had to go through the process of interviewing for it. She was so nervous, and she was the only one that was going for the job, and they knew that it was for her, but she was so nervous she couldn't answer the questions properly. They said, look, we can't offer it to you because you're going to have to go and tweak because you didn't answer them properly, so we can't honestly say yes. So she had to get some interview coaching to help position herself. She was the one that did the job, and she knew she had the job, but she just, she got so nervous. So we can talk ourselves out. We can think ourselves out of making an impactful interview or having an impactful conversation. So, but I'll give you the link, and I'll give you the codes and all that. So if you know anyone who is struggling, they can get access to that. And I hope that it gives them what they need to take that next step, and they get an even better job, and they think to themselves, I should have made this change years ago. Thank you for terminating my employment because I've got something much better, isn't it? Often through challenges, you end up somewhere much better that you may not have even thought was possible. So that is my hope for people who may be in that situation listening today.
Brilliant. And just like, because a lot of people, they're branding themselves, they're promoting themselves. So like with the different ones, like we mentioned earlier, like LinkedIn, we both like LinkedIn. But what do you find is the best way? Are you overwhelmed with it? And same with the book as well. Like, I don't know, did you self-publish or did you go with a publisher? But like the promotions in all you're doing, because whatever someone is doing, whether they want to be a speaker, podcaster, whatever it is, it's all about letting people know. You can't just open the door and they'll come running to you, because we know that doesn't work.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest hurdles, and this is something I think we all will struggle with from time to time. And I don't know, I think the culture is similar in the UK and even in Ireland here to Australia. We have what we call the tall poppy syndrome. And it's like, don't think too high of yourself or you'll just kind of get cut down. But that has ramifications to that. You may be someone who has got such diversity and such expertise. You need to be able to share and talk about it in a way that takes ego out of it, because no one likes an arrogant so-and-so, but you don't need to be arrogant. So many people, even when I was interview coaching, they would say to me, Annemarie, I don't want to big note myself. I was part of a team. I just did my job. And I said, you don't have to big note yourself. You don't have to tell everybody that, or the person that you're speaking to, that you're better than anyone else. But what you do want to do is you want to showcase the challenges that you've overcome, the initiatives that you've contributed. Doesn't say that, mean to say that I did everything I. But what you do want to do is share the success stories so that you can show them that you may be better placed to have that role, or you may be better placed to work with that client. So you're not big noting yourself and saying how wonderful you are, but rather showcasing and sharing, these are the things that I did. These are the challenges that I overcame. These were the initiatives that I put into place. And this is the outcome that came from that. Let your successes, let your stories, your case studies speak for themselves. And when you bring it forward in such a way that it is conversational and then it adds value to that organization, or even if you're talking to a prospective client, they will get the sense that, you know what you're talking about. And if you really relate it well to the situation that they have got, or the company, and where they're hoping to that role will grow with the company, then they'll be able to see if that's a good fit. And I think once people realize, I don't have to, toot my own horn, so to speak, but rather just share success stories. You share it in a way that you would normally, in your mannerisms, the characteristics and how you speak, and people will sense that. They'll pick up on that. Because so often we think I have to put on a mask. I have to, toot my own horn. You don't actually. Do it humbly. The most humble people are often the people that have, you'd look at them and they've got this huge, long, list of all of the things that they've done. That's just part and parcel of who they are. They go to work every day. They've got, initiatives, they've got innovations, but they do it with integrity and they do it with excellence, consistently. And when you talk about it in that way, that even, with humility, that comes across. So you don't have to kind of pat yourself on the back. Although sometimes you need to do that for yourself, because we can sometimes go the opposite extreme, can't we? And don't recognize the value that we bring. So it's a fine line between, I always say there's a fine line between arrogance and confidence. And for some people, they don't really know where that line is, but make sure you do. And then just walk with integrity that way, I think is best.
Lovely. So finally, you might tell people what your podcasts are, because I know you've got a lot as well. You might just say what they are.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I have the Ambitious Entrepreneur Show, and that is one of the shows that I absolutely love. That's my award-winning show. And that was actually syndicated for a couple of seasons on Zimbabwe local radio station, of all places. You just never know where your voice ends up. So that's Ambitious Entrepreneur Show. Then I have Women in Leadership podcast. And so it is talking, women who have been in leadership roles, whether they are executives in corporate or whether they are leaders in their own business. And then I have another show, which is the Christian Entrepreneurs Show. So those are people who have business, but they also have they've very much faith incorporated in that as well. And then I have a number of podcasts that are more so for my business alliance partners, Business Women Australia podcast, which has just been listed as #1 Australian women's podcasts in FeedSpot, I believe. And so that was a bit of a thrill. And then Business in Heels is another one that I host and produce for their members as well. So a bit of a lineup there, all around business and leadership.
And do you know how many you've actually done?
Oh, goodness. I've lost count, because the Christian Entrepreneur Show, when I first started, was a daily podcast. So that was a massive.
You're in the thousands. So.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And then we've also had not just podcast episode, but also live stream with panels and, events. There's a couple of organizations that I will often do MC, and it's a little bit like a podcast interview, because we'll have members across the globe of people who are speaking. So it's done more like a summit, still a bit of a podcast event, but so there's panels. So, it's not just one-on-one guests, but a panel guest. I love those too. Bit of navigating to do around, with the technology and the lineup there, but that's always a lot of fun. So yeah, thousands. I've lost count.
So listen, it's been wonderful speaking to you. So you might let people know how they can get in contact with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my personal website is annemariecross.com, but I love LinkedIn. I think you're on LinkedIn too, aren't you, Roy? So connect with me there. I've actually done just recently a 30-day challenge, but all of the videos are up there for people who would love to catch up on the replay. So if you search the hashtag and the number 30 days to distinction, and you'll be able to see. So every single day over September, we had a little tip on how to become distinguishable, uncopyable, and irresistible to your ideal client, so that when they're ready to make a choice, you are the choice versus just a choice for them. So that's something that people can catch up with if that's something that they're struggling with in their business.
Okay, excellent. And I put all the links in the podcast description, both on the audio and the video, as well as what you promised with the course, because that's greatly appreciated by a lot of people. So I appreciate you actually offering that as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, Roy. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
Thank you very much. So that's all for the Speaking Podcast. You can find all our episodes on speakingpodcast.com or on BitChute and YouTube. Be sure to give us a 5-star rating, review, thumbs up. It all helps, and share with your friends. Until next week, take care.